Right. Can everyone understand us? I was noticing that there were some audio issues. Please let us know if that continues. Um, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So our presentation is Web Accessibility in the Institutional Repository, Crafting User-Centered Submission Policies. My name is Jenny Hoops. I am the Open Access Publishing Manager for Indiana University Libraries, the Scholarly Communication Department. And taking the lead for this presentation is Margaret McLaughlin. She is the digital publishing assistant and the graduate student who helps with our department. She took the lead on the research and implementation for this strategy, so we owe a lot to her.
Right, so to get started, a little bit of background about what initiated this project. Was that the university, this came from an upper level administrative decision that was university-wide, campus-wide, where each department was asked to do an accessibility audit. This was not just for the libraries, this was across all campus departments, specifically for their web content, to check the accessibility of their web content. And our department, the Scholarly Communication Department, was asked to audit our content and report our findings to our Department of User Experiences. We weren't given any extra funds or any extra resources to do this. It was really just kind of an informal thing, and no official policy was implemented either before or during or after this. It was really, we were asked to do it and report our findings. So as we started doing our accessibility audit, when we got to our institutional repository, we realized that it required a little bit more nuanced of needs than a lot of our other content. So many of these institutional repositories were made in the mid to late aughts. Ours was circa 2007. Where accessibility wasn't really a huge concern. It was really to get the content loaded into the repository. So that means that a lot of the back content, especially in these repositories, a lot of the early content isn't accessible because it wasn't really created with accessibility in mind. And it's important to note that open access is not just about paywall. It's about access for all and by all. And that means people who need to use screen readers and that kind of thing. So moving towards like a truly open access repository means that it needs to be accessible to all. So this is why that accessibility audit was particularly important for our institutional repository. So starting to check the accessibility of our specific repository, we began by looking at our peer institutions. And we found that accessibility varied widely across different IRs. And some places were incredibly accessible, like places like Michigan and Cornell in particular. Most of their back content were accessible, and they really had firm documentation and policies to submit accessible content. And there were places that had absolutely no policies. And we were more towards that end of the spectrum. And again, because we weren't given any additional funding or resources, it wasn't tenable for us to go back and make all of our back content accessible and then automate some kind of accessible standards moving forward. So we had to kind of figure out what we could do with the resources that we had and doing the audit. And Jenny's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the process of auditing and what we found out.
Yes, so as Margaret mentioned, we wanted to go over quickly our accessibility audit strategies and hopefully provide some tools if you've been asked, especially informally without additional resources, to conduct accessibility overviews of your repositories or your general web presence. This is sort of the strategy we utilized. So we were asked to audit not only our institutional repository, but all scholarly communication managed websites. This included our public informational website, openscholarship.indiana.edu, our internal wiki pages. This was not only to encourage some of our documentation that we share with limited users, we were also hoping to make our documentation internally for future employees more accessible. Our journal publishing platform, which uses open journal systems. We have over 60 journals that we're currently publishing. Our 2 open access repositories, one of which will be the primary focus of today, the other we will bring up later in the presentation. Our blog, which is a WordPress site, and any and all LibGuides created by our department. So as Margaret mentioned, we weren't provided any additional resources of funding. We weren't able to hire an accessibility expert. We were able to collaborate, at least in limited ways, with the user experience department on our campus, which is wonderful. But as mentioned, they were helping not only the rest of the libraries, but in many cases, the rest of the university. A lot of research centers had a lot of library specific questions. So we began to look for publicly available, mostly open source tools. Some of you may be familiar with some of these tools. There's Wave, the web accessibility tool, FAY, which is run by University of Illinois, I believe, and then the plugin Google Lighthouse. So we created a template that allowed us to audit all of our website pages, utilizing information from all of these audits. At the end of this presentation, we will provide our resource template for how we conducted this audit with some examples of sort of how we presented information. We needed to present this information not only to our developers who had a lot of web accessibility experience, but also to potential department heads and deans who had little to no web development and accessibility experience. So this template worked to not only present the sort of essential information, technical information and technical fixes that would need to be conducted, but also present the information in a way where somebody with limited technical experience could understand the extent to which fixes needed to be made and at what level fixes needed to be made. All right, so the immediate results. So the short-term issues, I wouldn't say they were exactly quick to fix, but they were definitely immediately fixable. That was adding alt text to all our website images, removing empty links, especially for our repository, our forms and labels, not only our submission form when users actually submitted items to our repository, but also our contact form, making sure that they were properly labeled so that screen readers could read them, structuring web pages and metadata. Several of the software that we use for repositories, as well as our journal publishing program, was pretty good at already having well-structured web pages and metadata, but occasionally some of the metadata we entered needed to be rearranged. And also the coloring and shading of our websites. So basically making sure there was enough contrast and that the colors we used met accessibility guidelines recommended by those tools that we used. So those issues are, for the large part, have been fixed over the past 3 or 6 months since we've completed the audit. As we were looking over the results of the audit, we realized that there were 2 long-term issues that sort of arose for the rest of the need of this presentation. One is the university level website branding issues. Yet again, since this was coming from a, even though informal, university level administrative policy, we were confident that if we sort of collected any issues that we had found with branding, with website content outside of our control, we would be able to present that properly and someone at a higher level than us would handle it. However, the content that we've soon found to be the most troublesome was that a large majority of the content in our repository, institutional repository, was clearly not made accessible properly. And that became our sort of next focus as we attempted to fix the results of this audit. So a quick overview on our institutional repository. So our major institutional repository is IU ScholarWorks. It is an open access institutional repository that runs on DSpace software. As Margaret mentioned, it was created around 2007. It hosts a large variety of content. Like most institutional repositories, it focuses largely on articles that can properly be shared within copyright, as well as working papers. However, we do also accept a wide variety of file formats, such as video files, class and teaching materials. We can basically host any file format except for dynamic web content, but we have code, PowerPoint presentation, all sorts of content on the repository. And as we're examining the audit, not only did we realize a large amount of the back content and content currently being submitted was not being checked for accessibility and was indeed inaccessible, we also realized that there was no formal accessibility policy in place. So now we realize that the main accessibility issue in our department was the IR. So as Margaret mentioned, we begin to conduct peer assessment where sort of our peers with other institutional repositories at a similar level at. What does our dedication to open access entail? And Margaret already touched on this, but there's sort of that inherent issue between creating open access, not behind a paywall material, but making sure that material is actually accessible for everyone. And a topic that came up in our initial discussions, and I think I've heard a lot in sort of the scholarly conversation about this topic, is also if you restrict your repository to only accept accessible content, it's possible that you'll intimidate people from submitting content entirely. They might not make content available because it's very difficult to make accessible, or they might be intimidated or thrown off, and thus nobody could access the content, or the content is still locked behind a paywall. So we moved on to sort of what can we control as a department or need to request as an institutional change. And this sort of comes up as what can we do with our immediate resources and make sustainable, especially with considering the recent, I know a lot of upper level administrations and academic institutions have been heavily limited by COVID and other budget restrictions potentially for the next up to 1 to 4 years. So making sure that you can make sustainable changes that still make noticeable improvements in accessibility became our concern.
So building off what Jenny was just saying, and kind of based on how she broke down the kind of quick fixes or immediate fixes that we were able to do, I had mentioned that the IR, we needed to address more kind of nuanced needs to address accessibility. So we identified a sort of accessibility policy spectrum, where one end is the responsibilities fall entirely on the user, and the user decides whatever accessibility tools the user adds to the document is what is on what goes into the repository. And the opposite end of the spectrum, it is entirely library facilitated. So either there are accessibility services and they go back and make back content accessible. So you can see that we've also broken down some middle steps. So right in the middle, there's an equal balance of labor between user and library. And then towards the left end, libraries will provide guidelines or recommendations, and the user gets to choose to comply to them or not. So still kind of the library is encouraging accessibility, but a lot of the responsibility still falls on the user, but it's still more than there aren't any practices or guidelines. And then more towards the right end of the spectrum, still a combination between user and library. The library can offer some services and some tech intervention, but it still is up to the user to comply to those and needs to do a little bit more on their own. So when we started, we were at the complete left end of the spectrum. We had no practices or no guidelines, and it was really whatever the user chose was what was deposited into our repository. And it had been and has been stated, since we were given no funds, we weren't really able to move very far down this spectrum. So we were really aiming towards step 2, because that fit in to the resources that we had. And we also wanted to make sure that we could create guidelines that users would engage with, that they wouldn't just kind of gloss over. So we really tried to think through how to make guidelines that were effective and that were going to be able to engage the users and easily engage the users to be able to comply to these kind of accessibility guidelines or recommendations. So we started at step 0 and or step 1 on the complete left end of the spectrum. And we were aiming towards step 2. That's kind of where we were hoping to get to when we started this next step of this institutional repository accessibility improvement. So for our plan, we decided to focus on the submission process. We have this 3-step submission process, and the steps are delineated on this slide. It's check your rights, contact IU ScholarWorks, and submit your work. So users are already responsible for copyright. They have to decide, they have to figure out on their own by reading our copyright material if they're able to deposit their materials. And also they have to contact IU ScholarWorks for permission. We have a little bit of a unique situation where they have to contact us even with an IU affiliated account or email address. Users cannot automatically submit to the repository. They have to receive permission by emailing iusw@indiana.edu and select a collection of their choice in which to deposit their work. So we're already engaging users with our material and via email. So we figured that adding another level of engagement to our submission work will kind of just increase this dialogue and engagement between us and users and focus more on kind of this equal balance between user and library services. So we really decided to rework this third step here to focus on improving accessibility. We have a submission guide, and we decided that it would be a good idea to emphasize the importance of accessibility and including an accessible document in the submission guide. So the goal for this submission guide, we decided to rework it. We didn't completely get rid of it and start from scratch, but we just decided to update what we currently had. And our goal was to develop new submission guidelines that emphasize the importance of depositing accessible documents. And as Jenny had mentioned, we really wanted to posit these as recommendations. We don't have any hard and fast requirements because we didn't want to discourage anybody from submitting or overwhelm submitters with requirements. We really wanted content was kind of the first step, and then encouraging accessibility moving forward, kind of doing that more and more. So what we decided to do was provide quick guidelines on making the most commonly submitted file types accessible. So we really focused on moving forward to have all of our content be as accessible as possible by encouraging authors to make their documents accessible. And all of the steps and recommendations that we added to our new submission guide are steps that can be added to an already completed document. And that was an important thing for us, is we didn't want to make users have to have to go back and start their document all over. All of these guidelines can be added to an already existing document, kind of quick fixes to make an already existing document more accessible. And by integrating them into our submission guide, which users have to follow to properly submit their work, it really encourages users to consider accessibility before uploading their document. So we made it part of the process, so they have it on their mind and have to think through it before uploading their final document and agreeing to depositing their work in our repository. So starting this process and identifying exactly how to incorporate these new guidelines, I began some research to create these quick fixes. And it started similar to how we started checking our IR's accessibility overall, by looking at our peer institutions. So I researched IR's and other just general university accessibility guidelines to see what other policies were in place and what our peer institutions were doing in terms of accessibility guidelines and standards. A really helpful resource, and one that I used a lot, was the University of Washington's IT accessibility checklist and tutorial. It's very clear, it's very comprehensive, it's very accessible. So I spent a lot of time on that, and as well as many other kind of peer institutions and other websites. And from that, I was able to pull a list of best practices. And each IR may choose that, if you choose to do something similar, that you may want to emphasize different best practices. These are the ones that we thought best for our institutional repository, and the ones that we thought were most important, and they are listed in order of what we thought were most important for accessibility based on the research and based on our peer institutions and what we were able to kind of draw and conglomerate from these sources. So these best practices the first was to use headings and structural tags. So that's to make sure a screen reader can jump between sections and that everything is clearly labeled. The second is to add alternative text to all images. And the third is to export from Word to PDF to preserve accessibility. The guidelines delineate between Word and PDF. They provide steps for both Word and PDF, the two most common file formats. And a lot of these are easier, or at least more user-friendly, to apply to a Word document. So I wanted to make sure to include steps on how to preserve an accessible Word document and convert it to PDF, because it's a very, very simple step, but it's often one that people overlook. And then if they convert it, all those accessibility steps get lost. So we wanted to make sure that we can preserve as you switch between file format. So those were the main three. And then we included a fourth section about miscellaneous other kind of accessibility things to consider, like identifying a document language, using conscientious hyperlinks, both that the hyperlinks resolve and lead to the right link that you're hoping to get to, and then also that they replicate the content that the link is linking out to. Don't just hyperlink something that says link, but hyperlink the title of the web page or something like that, so somebody can understand just by looking at what is linked what they will be going to. And also by properly identifying lists, that kind of thing all helps the document be a lot more accessible. So once we kind of pulled these, and these quick fixes are, I will highlight them a little bit later when I actually show our new and old submission guide, and they're also included in our resources at the end of this presentation. We've kind of pulled out those quick fixes. But once we had these quick fixes, we decided to incorporate them into our submission guide, as previously mentioned. And we spent a lot of time kind of considering how we were going to incorporate them into our submission guide, and we ultimately went with kind of sliding them in between already existing steps. So we decided to place these accessibility guidelines between step 2, describe, and step 3, upload. I will show you both of these submission guides in just 1 minute. So if these kind of steps seem a little abstract right now, don't worry, I'll have something concrete in just about a minute. And we also had to cut down our accessibility guidelines a lot. So what was really important for us was not to overwhelm users, because by overwhelming them with too many accessibility guidelines, that could discourage them from looking at them or engaging with them at all. So I originally had about 1.5 pages, a little over, of new kind of quick fixes. And after a lot of consideration and conversation among the department, we made the decision to cut it down and consolidate it to 1 page. So we really just kind of had to cut it down and submit it and incorporate it between these steps 2 and 3. Each university, each repository may have different ideals and different standards and may choose to make them shorter or longer, but this is what we decided worked best for us and worked best with the length of our submission guide. So after incorporating these new guidelines, we went back and made the new document accessible, because it was not at all. There were no tags, there was no alt text. It relied very heavily on screenshots with very inconsistent captioning, and it just was really clearly not created with accessibility in mind. So after incorporating these new guidelines, we went back and made the actual document accessible. So I'm going to briefly exit our PowerPoint and show you the old versus the new submission guide. Okay, so here is our original submission guide. And again, none of these included any alt text or any structural tags. So we can see here's a very large screenshot that didn't have alt text or wasn't captioned. And this kind of details the process of just very beginning. And then here's where we really get into a lot of the work that we did. So you can see that there's not a caption here. These are kind of just a little bit all over the place. But this is the step 1 was to describe. Here is just step 1 continued. Here's step 2, describe again. This is just another set of metadata elements that the author can choose to add subject keywords or an abstract. So there are kind of 2 steps. One is title, author, that kind of thing. This is rights and subject keywords. But again, inconsistent captioning, relying very heavily on screenshots. And then step 3, right after step 2, sorry, I accidentally clicked on a link. Right after step 2, users uploaded their files. And then right after that, they reviewed it. Step 5 was agreeing to a license, and then step 6 was to complete the submission. And that was our previous submission guide. Our new submission guide is this. So it looks very similar, but everything is tagged, and there are structural tags, so a screen reader can read this. These steps are pretty much the same. But if you notice, Now that everything is captioned, so that was a big step, was cleaning up, consolidating, editing down, making them much more concise, and captioning everything. So while we relied almost exclusively on these screenshots before, they're kind of screenshot led, but all of the content is replicated in the captions, so nothing is lost. So that was a big step for focusing on this kind of new submission guide, is there are all captions on all of them. More captions. Here's step 2. And as you can see, after step 2, instead of going to uploading a file, these are our guidelines. These are accessibility guidelines. We made them step 3, accessibility check. And it pulls off, these are just quick fixes. It breaks down Word and PDF, so you can choose, it's kind of like choose your own adventure. You can kind of like, depending on what document you have, you can follow those guidelines. So it's pretty easy to break down. So you don't have to read everything. You can just pick exactly what you want for each document. And we've tested this both with this document and with other documents in both other content that our department had, and they worked fairly well. And we made sure to do kind of a test run on somebody who hadn't worked on this document. So we gave the accessibility guidelines and asked somebody to make a document accessible, and they were able to follow it. So that was a bit of a test that we did. So while it does go into 2 pages, that's because it starts on the 2nd page, but this document freestanding is 1 page. And then after the accessibility check, it goes back to upload, and then review, license, and complete. So those are the difference between the old guidelines and the new submission guide. I'm gonna return to our PowerPoint really quickly. Go. And Jenny is going to talk a little bit about the results of this and what we plan to do moving forward. Is it not sharing?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, looking good. Yes, so looking forward, we haven't done a formal assessment yet. We are waiting annually, as well as some of the results from the larger accessibility initiative around campus. But it has been 6 months since our new submission guide was made public. As mentioned earlier, we do know that we get quite a bit of traffic on the submission guide, not only from checking how much it's referenced, but we utilize it in every single submission. Every time someone requests a submission, we send out the submission guide, though obviously there's no way to enforce or know that they've read through it. But we have seen from a quick informal assessment that new user deposited PDF and Word documents have showed much higher accessibility rates. So basically we've seen a 38% increase in completely accessible files, according to a random sample that we completed from the 6 months after the submission period versus 6 months before the new submission guide was implemented. This is also complete accessibility. We are aware that since we implemented these quick fixes, there are some accessibility, we're hoping actually that in some cases, the document unfortunately couldn't have been made accessible unless it was made accessible from creation, but at least it was made more accessible through our guidelines. So yeah, as mentioned, we plan to do more formal, thorough assessment later. All right, so revisiting the spectrum, we're now sort of working on solidifying that our step 2. Yet again, we're in talks with, we need to make sure it complies with the university accessibility and library level accessibility policy, which since both have not quite been confirmed yet, we can't as formally integrate these accessibility guidelines or create a formal accessibility policy yet. So we're still developing step 2. We are hoping to move to step 3, hopefully within the next year, especially as we begin to work more with remediation of previous back content on a case-to-case basis. But this sort of shows that sometimes you really have to take very slow steps sort of at a time. It's taken almost a year from us to move to no policy to even just recommendations. And we're hoping that slow process is better than none. So some future developments that we have planned, for example, accessibility guidelines for other file formats. So this isn't as much a concern for video content because we actually have to submit media content such as video and audio, on behalf of the users anyway. So we've just updated our processes, and we're actually going through and applying transcriptions to all of our content in collaboration with our media department. However, we are hoping to open up a new open data repository moving forward. Obviously, data is incredibly varied in its file formats, and accessibility of data is not quite as well researched or as straightforward as something like a PDF document or even a video file. We are hoping yet again, since we have this unique opportunity of creating a new repository, to sort of integrate accessibility more explicitly. And as mentioned before, so there are some deposits, especially for our second institutional repository, which has only been casually mentioned, that's actually completely facilitated by staff. So we are just updating our workflows to have staff do accessibility overviews of all of our PDF content before going in, since that is completely library facilitated already. But yet again, we are trying to keep an eye on sustainability. Since we've implemented accessibility to our other workflows or staff-led workflows, we're trying to expand some of our timelines, sort of talk to administration and say, listen, we can make future content accessible, but now the timeline for total deposit or for a normal workflow has been extended. And yet again, with recent resource limitations, especially caused by COVID, this is essential to consider, and hopefully your administrations will also be understanding that progress might be slow. In terms of approaching our repository back content, we had previously had discussions of hiring student workers and training them to make our most popular PDFs accessible. We're currently doing remediation on a case-by-case basis by request. That's usually completed by our graduate students who are trained in accessibility. And we only offer that for Word or PDF. Yet again, for video content, that's now automatically part of our process. For other formats, we can provide resources, but we actually do leave that to the user, since we don't want to put more of a burden on our student workers and staff. We also are hoping to work with Library Technologies to develop accessibility checker for our new repository. Since repository migration is hopefully imminent, as you might have noticed, our version of DSpace is quite a few years out of date. And we are hoping to migrate platforms the next 3 years. So Library Technologies is actually developing Indiana University Libraries is developing their own repository software. And we are now entering discussions to sort of not only implement an accessibility policy when we move to that new repository, but also to sort of integrate existing accessibility sort of APIs and checkers, that when people submit content, it'll sort of come up with sort of an error message and say, sorry, this document isn't accessible. Whether or not we would then force them to fix it on their behalf, we would contact library. That's a sort of a future discussion. We need to get the new repository up and running, hopefully in the next 3 years before that happens. But it's definitely something that this audit and this development has really taught us, is that when you are either migration or the creation of new repository is sort of the key moment to implement and integrate accessibility. All right. So we'll start tackling the questions. I'll just start going through the Q&A, if that's all right. I'll try and answer as many live as we can. Margaret, I'll let you know if I think you can tackle it better. All right, so the first one is, many IRs migrate to different software over time. Will accessibility be part of the future decision-making and implementation? I think the last slide hopefully answered all of that question that you were hoping to hear. Yet again, since our migration is in the next 3 years, those discussions are starting, but I'd like them to be more developed as we move forward. The next question is, if a remediation is requested for a stored document, who is doing the work? So I also mentioned that looking forward and sort of earlier, that's usually done by our students who actually have the most accessibility training. If there's something that is beyond sort of our standards, yet again, none of us were formally trained in accessibility, we send it to our accessibility ATAC, which is our accessible learning department that is not officially affiliated with the libraries, it's affiliated with our university technologies, just because they have most of the accessibility experts. But since they're also dealing with a lot of class-based content and are going to prioritize the needs of specific students, the timeline in that is usually pretty slow. So right now, the key to remediation we've found is to be limiting the type of file formats that we'll offer remediation to, and then prioritizing stuff with a lot of views or content. All right. So regarding file formats and content with Creative Commons licenses, we work on OERs and intentionally make our content for which derivatives can be made in Word format instead of PDF. Do you include this type of content in your IR, and how do you prioritize best practice for reuse and access? So I'm hoping I tackled the correct parts of this question. Feel free to allow for a follow-up if I don't. But I'm assuming you're talking about sort of like Creative Commons derivative licenses. As Margaret mentioned before, part of our guidelines, the quick fixes that Margaret created, included a lot of export information. So how to make accessibility changes when you export, especially between the Word and PDF formats. We do include all sorts of content in the IR, but as mentioned before, if it's one of those non-traditional, non-Word or PDF, should I say, formats, then we don't necessarily offer direct remediation, although we'll sort of offer a consultation with the user and find independent resources to sort of make the content accessible. But I think our duty or our part of the remediation at that point is to provide sort of, here's our guidelines that we have from exports, here's sort of our best practices. All right. Since your submission guide is a PDF rather than integrated into the submission workflow, how commonly do submitters completely ignore and bypass these instructions? So honestly, we don't know. Yet again, we think our unique part of our submission process is the fact that they sort of have to get in contact with me in order to, or should I say our staff, in order to submit to the repository at all. So I know that they at least have received the file. They can't just completely ignore the submission guide. And I do, yet again, from just web page views, because it's also available on our web page, it gets a reasonable amount of traffic. I am hoping, and yet again, I've been asked to wait on this until we have a library-wide and then university-wide accessibility policy. I'm hoping to sort of have it not only in the submission guide, but have a page sort of pop up after the describe process and before the upload formally in our submission process. The problem is whether or not we would ask people to agree that they've read that, whether or not we would require that. It's looking quite possible that our library will move forward with sort of a general requirement policy. So they'll not only agree that they've read those statements, but then apply them to the rest of their abilities. And in that case, if we had sort of formal university backing on that, we might sort of use the more extensive guidelines because we would want to provide more documentation. All right. Sorry, I might have skipped one. Okay, charts can be a challenge for accessibility. How do you handle those? So yet again, I think that's an excellent example of something that we kind of had to not explicitly lay out in our quick fixes, just because we did want to make sure that the content on our submission guide was more limited. And so part of the problem was there's not as of an explicit walkthrough of how to, I know charts and graphs. I actually used to work for sort of like I used to work for the ATAC department in our libraries, or should I say for our technological services, and those can take very long descriptions to fully provide informative alt text. So our guides don't provide the full amount of information that might be helpful, but I do believe they link or provide external resources. So it's definitely something where I think the cost of trying to make sure that the fixes were very quick, make sure that people aren't intimidated or aren't thrown off by the accessibility, means that that was kind of left behind. And that's something we'd like to obviously continue working on moving forward. Okay, so I'm gonna answer the top two questions. Have you performed usability testing with students, faculty who require accessible formats? So not at our level, but as part of the accessibility, the user experience department is actually conducting those, and then they inform us of the results. So we do not do that on the department level. Our user experience department is in charge of that. And they are still completing their audits, so we have not gotten the full results from that. But we have kept them sort of up to date on our updates. So we're hoping to receive even more thorough feedback if the sorts of people that the actual users that we're attempting to help, we're hoping that they will give us even more thorough feedback and we will change things accordingly. So yet again, that's sort of one of the disadvantages or possible advantages that comes from a university level is we're getting the experts that are actually taking back these usability testing. Yeah, and in terms of sharing feedback, we will definitely, as soon as we receive it, we will definitely make that available in our resources list, which is listed on the next slide. I'm also going to check the time really quickly. I haven't been good at, okay, we've still got time. All right, sorry, let me look through these questions. Okay, so I think Margaret can answer this. I'm curious why you put the accessibility check as third step instead of first step before a user engages with the submission form.
That's an excellent question. And we went back and forth a lot on where to put these, if we wanted them to be a freestanding document, if we wanted them first. And we kind of decided that having them be where they were fit best in the flow of the submission process, in particularly the user's engagement with their document. So, because the first two steps are metadata mostly, are inputting the metadata of their document. And then the original third step was to upload it. So we were concerned that if we put it first and then immediately asked users to kind of upload, to input their metadata, that they would kind of just overlook that and just go right to inputting kind of the metadata. But since they already probably have it pulled up to put in their title, their author, that kind of thing, we really wanted to emphasize to do this right before uploading the document, where they have to have it pulled up to upload it, they have to get ready. So really asking them to engage with the document and engage with accessibility at the point when they're most engaged with their document in the submission process. So like right before they're about to upload it. It's not something that they can do, because a lot of the metadata they can possibly do by memory. So we thought that it made the most sense to do it right here, right when we think most users would be most engaged with their document, actually probably have it pulled up, to go back and be more encouraged to add these accessibility guidelines. But everybody may be different. This is one of the things, and especially why we wanted to create this freestanding document, is to be able to kind of move them around. We went back and forth a lot on where we wanted to place them, but we really wanted to emphasize kind of right before uploading your document, do this accessibility check. And really, it's make it a little bit more integrated into the document and into kind of this active engagement with it as well.
All right. So how about, all right, so you mentioned that you decided to edit down the accessibility steps in the submission guide. Does the submission guide include information for submitters who want to make additional changes to increase the accessibility of their documents? So I know that Margaret, as part of the quick fixes, we do also link to additional guidelines. So Margaret, you might be able to include that in more detail. I think mostly in terms of alt text, which also sort of covers another question I saw previously about fine arts. So we especially decided to try to provide additional information for people describing images and charts, as mentioned earlier. Yet again, we don't have any special standards, partially because we don't deal with a lot of artwork and images directly. People, yet again, can preserve those, but we actually, Indiana University has an image archive collection that's much more thorough and has art-specific metadata. So we do welcome those types of content, and we have some sort of basic alt text guidelines as well as links out to more thorough alt text guidelines. But in general, if somebody, yet again, for those file formats that are not covered, especially not Word or PDF or video, that are not covered by sort of our current program, we will, on a consultation basis, provide external resources that we found, especially ones provided through our Indiana Technological Department. All right. What program platform do you use for submissions? So we just use the internal DSpace submission platform. To the best of my knowledge, when our plans to migrate to our new repository, we will also be using the repository platform submission guide or submission process. So yet again, we're kind of linked to whatever the submission process built into that platform is like. I do know that some institutional repositories use external submission platforms, which I think is actually a really good idea in terms of like being able to implement your own accessibility checkers, implement your own sort of unique guidelines. But at least for the next few years, we'll be using whatever we have currently implemented. So I sort of went over the fine arts program question. Please feel free to reiterate if there's any other issues. But in terms of importing artworks in more detail, yet again, usually if somebody approaches us with a physical object, we usually do not provide the scanning service depending on the size of the object. Simply we'll work with digital collections. In that case, ensuring accessibility would probably still be in the, would either be the job of that other department for providing alternative text or providing some other form of accessibility options, would either be responsibility of the other department or still the responsibility of the user. But usually if we are dealing with sort of artworks, paintings, photographs, we're dealing with a copy that has already been made digital. All right. Accessibility may drive usage if consumers see some sort of verification on the file. Do you plan to badge remediated and submitted content that is accessible? So we do currently not have that in the works, but I think that's a really good idea moving forward. But unfortunately, we do not have any plan currently. Yet again, I think with everything still moving forward, I think that's going to be something that we would possibly integrate into our new repository migration, but with our new limited staff and looking like our staff will still be limited, I think unfortunately just ensuring that future content is accessible is going to be our highest priority. But I think yet again, especially since we have plans to potentially have some sort of accessibility checker, all that sort of content for our new repository, implementing something like that would be much easier. Are your guidelines licensed for reuse so others could benefit by easily adding accessibility quick fixes to their submission guidelines? Yes, they are, and we will be linking in our resources to all of those resources, not only the older submission guide and the newer submission guide, but also just the quick fixes pages and the template we used for presenting our audit results to our department head as well as to our UX department and developers. So all of those are licensed for reuse. Okay. What software specifically are you using to measure accessibility, and do you have a threshold? And for preservation purposes, are you archiving original submissions from back content that you are remediating? Okay, so for the first part of that question, we're actually using the similar open source publicly available software to measure for accessibility, or we're using sort of IU's institutional accessibility checker that we have internal access to. We didn't have a formal threshold, though I think our sort of future goal, a number that was tossed around a lot, was having about 75% of our content accessible. Things might change because a lot of our content that we were nervous would be really difficult to make accessible, our data content, is going to be moved to our new data repository. And now our media collections department is helping us make our media collection, our previous media content accessible. So we're sort of, as we continue to collaborate with other departments around campus, we're very fortunately sort of hopefully raising that threshold over time. For the second part of the question, preservation purposes, are you archiving original submissions from back content that you are remediating? I'm assuming you're talking about versioning in that case. Like, are we keeping the initial inaccessible version and then also the accessible version? And we do support versioning in that. Like, we do include the previous version, especially if there's format changes, noticeable format changes. I hope that answers your question. But yet again, for the remediation of content, we've actually had very few requests for words and PDF remediation. It's almost all been for video content, which we also facilitate with our media services. Okay, yes, yeah, so the original submission. Yeah, so for Word and PDF remediations that we've done, we do have sort of versions. We sort of mark in our repository, like file descriptions for like initial version, and then I think we do like new accessible version and all that kind of stuff. Yet again, I think we've only done that for about 3 to 5 Word or PDF files. We've had several more remediation requests, but almost all of them have been for video content, which I'm not sure exactly. I'm actually not sure if versions kept, because I think it's usually just adding transcriptions and captions, so the video file mostly remains the same, but I believe that there's not versioning in that instance. But I would need to discuss that with our media's department more explicitly. All right. Could you say a little more about your process of creating transcripts for video? Is library staff doing that work, and how much of their time is spent on it? Have you run into any examples of needing transcriptions of videos in other languages? So I can't completely discuss this as much as I like, because yet again, our media services department is facilitating a lot, but I will say that I know the tool we can use, and if you want to contact us, Mark, if you want to move to the next slide. If you want to contact us, I can actually, I don't have that workflow available currently on our resources, but I can work with people on an individual basis. So IU has Kaltura. We're using a lot of Kaltura video hosting content, and they can generate sort of machine read captions and transcriptions for items that we have users then edit. We have either our media services or our users edit to actually meet the needs of the video. So that is completed by library staff, although not always library staff in my department. Do you plan to provide any future workshops?
That's about time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you both very much for your presentation, and thank you all for attending this session. This recording will be posted to our YouTube channel. The speakers will be monitoring the NASIG forum through June 2020 for any questions not covered during the session. Join us again actually at 1:15 for our next session. So actually, I suppose you can actually go on for a few more questions if people are willing.
Yeah. And I do want to say too in our slides, not only do we have the resource list, but please feel free to contact us if you have further questions. I'll try to tackle like 1 or 2 more questions.
Sure.
But feel free to email us. Do you plan to provide any future workshops for submitters to help them create accessible documents from the start so they don't have to remediate the documents? I would love to do that. We actually have, well, we used to have a lot of very consistent workshop series that were provided by Indiana University and sort of like our Scholars Commons, our Learning Commons, sort of our outreach and learning department. Obviously, the nature of those have changed with the recent shift to remote work, which Indiana is still mostly dedicated to. So as those move digitally, I think we definitely hope to provide workshops and especially invite people that we know are sort of heavy submitters. As people who manage institutional repositories know, there's usually, there's lots of individual submitters, but then there's also usually several submitters who very consistently publish. So reaching out to them and giving them the opportunity to attend those workshops, especially as we rework those workshops to be digital, probably online only, is something that we're looking into. So we, just looking through the last couple of questions, we share a link to our updated guidelines at the end of the presentation, and a resource link that was also, I believe, shared with chat. Thank you so much for doing that, Wendy. Workshops, can you speak a bit about who is required to submit to IR, master dissertation graduate, a completely voluntary outreach specific to the IR? So that's something that I would definitely, if you are interested in outreach, we have several services. We actually have very few requirements for the IR. It's not required for master's or dissertation graduates, except in certain schools where the school's graduate department has decided to make it required. We actually have a CV service where we go through people's CVs and help them find copyright for items and deposit items. I have a lot of resources and documentation on those. If you're interested, please reach out to the email mentioned. But in general, it's completely voluntary, which self-deposit rates are usually a little limited, but if we offer sort of any sort of facilitated services, just particularly through our CV service, we've gotten hundreds of items through those services, and I'd love to talk more about them. So I think the last question that I could tackle, for migrating to our new repository, yet again, this is on the timeline 3 to 5 years, so this isn't formally in the talks, but our homegrown system is through, I believe it's HIRAX, which is in development in association with quite a few universities. I have a feeling that there will be, as that technology continues to be developed, there will be a lot more, much more thorough presentations presented by the library technologies people, the wonderful library technologies people developing it. And working through it. And I believe it will be made open source, but hopefully we'll be able to share not only information on that repository, but also on the accessibility measures we hope to put in place. And I hope that covers at least all of the questions sent through the Q&A. Please either contact us or use the discussion board if you have additional questions.